Great. Okay. Welcome to my crib and welcome back to the ACM YouTube channel. Today is going to be pretty quick. We're just going to talk a little bit about CSS frameworks. This isn't super theoretical. This is more of just kind of a quick tour of what's the landscape look like right now in terms of CSS frameworks, which are kind of like libraries for CSS. At the same time, assuming we keep these videos up for some time, if you watch this video past 2021, this information may be incorrect. So if that is the case and somehow for some reason you're still watching videos of me in 2021, A, congrats, you made it out of 2020, and B, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But at the same time, the reason I want to make this video was because a lot of the resources you'll find online that float around, especially about jQuery and Bootstrap, are outdated. And they use information from 2012 to 2016, and at the time it was correct, but web development has changed a lot, and I want to kind of recenter what the picture is going to look like. But yeah, so today's kind of just going to be a website walkthrough, pretty casual. But the first thing I just want to talk about is what exactly is a CSS framework. So as we've noticed, Peter hates cards, but it turns out cards are extremely common. And it actually requires quite a bit of code to write a good card implementation, right? One that resizes a lot, handles images gracefully. Maybe you also want to support right to left languages like Arabic, for example. And all of these things are things that you could code, but that's a lot of work. And to be honest, as you flesh out more and more of your website, maybe you want a navigation bar as well, or a carousel to show some photos, or you want custom buttons. There's a big chance that you're going to miss out on important accessibility things or internationalization things or print layout or all these other kind of obscure and niche things that you don't normally learn about. But we will teach you about with a guest lecture from my friend about accessibility some time down the road. But in the meantime, the solution is to use libraries that someone else wrote, because there are tons of other people who are much smarter than me who are much better at writing CSS than I am. So why not use their open source work for our advantage? So that's what a CSS framework is. The differentiation between a framework and a library is kind of semantic, but the idea is really a framework tends to usually provide you things out of the box that you can use to build your website, like a nav bar or a card or buttons or form controls or carousels or list groups or panels or whatever you want to call them. Versus libraries, usually we like to think of libraries as just providing functionality. And I'll kind of show you a delineation between super framework and not so much framework. But okay, long story short, how are we going to use these things? So in general, it's just going to be a CSS file that someone gives you. Similar to the CSS files that you write, you will use the link tag. You're going to put in rel style sheet that says, hey, the thing I've linked to is a CSS style sheet. Please interpret it with your CSS interpreter. Similarly, we're going to have the href. Notice here that instead of using a local path, right, like where the file is relative to your HTML file, now we're going to use HTTPS and then a protocol. One quick note about HTTP versus HTTPS that I should include in the notes for this is that if you load your resources with HTTP, it will make your entire site HTTP, which is bad because browsers will say that your site is insecure. And nowadays, HTTPS has been the standard for quite some time. So it's very unlikely that you won't be able to find a link with HTTPS. So please, if you can, use that. And more generally, when you load resources, use HTTPS when you can. If you use HTTP, that's bad. It means your website is insecure. Then there are these two other attributes. And this is not super important to remember, but I want to point this out in case you want to know what you're doing with random people's code. So the first thing is this integrity hash. So if you hit up our friends at ACM Cyber that talk about steganography and code verification, they'll tell you that integrity basically is making sure that the file you're downloading is the file you want to download. Why is this a problem? So imagine if someone modified the CSS file that you downloaded and included some virus or something. And this is hard to do with CSS because it's not Turing complete. Actually, well, depends. But you can definitely do sketchy things with CSS that you shouldn't be able to do, right? For example, maybe a malicious attacker could hide a button on your website or change the link that a button on your website points to. That's obviously a bad thing. So what we do is we apply a hash to it. And a hash is really just not super important. It's like a function, and it's very hard to replicate two different things that hash to the same thing. That's really all you need to know. So this thing right here is a hash that comes along with the file. And you get this from the people who made the files. In this case, this is a Bootstrap link, so Bootstrap. And they're going to say, hey, wherever you download this file, it doesn't matter where, it should hash to this. If it doesn't hash to this, someone along the chain has spoofed our file and it's not safe. And in fact, if your hash is off, your browser won't load the file. So let's take a look. I'm going to delete some stuff here in this hash. I'm going to reload it, and look, the style stopped because the browser said, uh-oh, there's been a problem. Your file doesn't match your hash. And in this case, the hash is wrong. But normally, you know, the file is wrong. This is mostly optional. Like if I don't include this at all, this will load properly. But you should use it if they provide it. I think it's not a bad thing to do. I'm just going to keep it in the back of your mind. Secondly is this thing cross-origin. This is mandatory. So this has to do with something called CORS, which is a cross-origin request site service, something like that. I just call it CORS. The long story short, the gist is you need to be nice to people when you use their resources. If you're not nice to them, you can overload their server. And CORS has to do with being nice to people. I linked a guide about CORS in the README for this lesson. It's pretty long. If you want to read it, I would recommend you to do so. And it is important if you go on in a career in web development. But for learning labs in particular, we're not going to worry about this. And as it turns out, we're not going to have to deal with this at all. But that's kind of getting ahead of myself. OK, cool. So now we know how to use a CSS framework. Long story short, just follow what the documentation says and don't download sketchy CSS files. So what kinds of frameworks exist? I'm going to start with one called Bootstrap. So you can see on my screen right here, this is Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, just to give you a little bit of history, used to be called Twitter Bootstrap. And as you can imagine, it was made by Twitter in 2011, 2012. And at that time in history, back when I was 12 years old, CSS frameworks were not very popular. And in addition, browsers were not very good at implementing CSS features properly. So, you know, yesterday, we talked about Flexbox and CSS Grid. These things didn't exist back then. You had to use janky table hacks and vendored prefixes and all these other kinds of weird things. So Bootstrap was one of the first attempts to really standardize how your website looked on every single browser. And furthermore, if everyone on your team used Bootstrap, it meant that your website would look the same. And this is actually one of the big reasons that a lot of people theorize that Twitter got so popular, because they had a really consistent user interface. And if you compare that to MySpace, which was the exact opposite, right? On MySpace, everyone can customize their own profile. Then you just get like random people's songs playing and like weird Unicode text and flashing seizure, epilepsy causing things, and that wasn't good. So Bootstrap is kind of the antithesis of that. It's a very consistent design. Since then, it's like been extremely popular. You know, millions and millions of websites use it. It's hard to get an exact statistic, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of 18 million to 40 million unique distinct websites. And let's take a look at what it looks like. And it looks a lot like Twitter, is what I'm going to tell you. But this is going to be the example that I talk about in the README. Basically, this is something that you can build with Bootstrap. And what is the sell of Bootstrap? Bootstrap gives you these components that you can build without coding the CSS yourself. So let's take a look. So this demo I have right here is like one portion of that card I just showed you, right? And this is the CSS that we wrote for this card. Notice that this, you don't have to write any extra CSS. Bootstrap has already done all of it for you. And this is the really convenient part, right? There are components that you'll use to build your website, things like a button, like an unstyled list, like a card that we know Peter doesn't like. These kinds of things are very standard. And if you're the kind of person who likes building websites with these kinds of components, Bootstrap is 100% for you. And so you can make complicated layout pages like this without writing a single line of CSS. All you're focused on is the content. And that's a really appealing draw, especially if you don't like CSS. If you want to take a quick tour, so comparatively, we're going to find out that Bootstrap offers a lot of components. So this is their list. They have things like alerts and badges and breadcrumb navigation and buttons and carousel is a big one I'm going to talk about quite a bit, which means that you can, you know, create an image that loops it. This is very hard to do by yourself, by the way. This is like one of the big things that Bootstrap is really good at. It has lots of form controls. This is a really big deal too. This is very hard to do yourself properly with accessibility built in. So this is the big draw of Bootstrap. very consistent, clean UI. In addition, I'll just quickly point out that they do a great job about caring about those things I told you that oftentimes we don't. So Bootstrap, for example, has code to deal with right to left languages, right? If you switch to Arabic, you can turn on right to left mode, and it'll automatically place this text box on the right over there. And the same thing with all of these things. By default, your code probably won't do that because you haven't thought about the problem. No offense. Similarly, Bootstrap has a lot of print utilities as well, right? So if we go to some random website, like jQuery's website, and then we hit print, right? You're going to notice that this does not look at all like what that was going to look like, right? And there's actually ways that you can optimize your page so that it prints really well, right? That it doesn't print random color blocks or decorative elements, or highlights the links properly so that you can see where they go. Notice, for example, here, this tells you the link because you can't highlight over a link on a piece of paper. This kind of stuff, Bootstrap also does for you. Finally, one last quick thing about Bootstrap is that you can customize it yourself. So if you're like, man, I don't like the colors that Bootstrap provides, these colors, you can easily change them yourself. And in fact, there are tons and tons of what we call Bootstrap themes that will take Bootstrap and adjust them. So for example, material design is like Google's design thing. This looks like a Google website, right? And they'll take existing Bootstrap components and then recolor them and redesign them so they look like something from Google, right? And this is really, really popular, and it's very powerful because it means that you are not restricted to making your website look like everyone else who uses Bootstrap. You can kind of use it however you want, but still take advantage of the features that they provide. Okay, so it sounds like Bootstrap's like super sexy. It's the best thing in the world, and everyone should use it. So what are the downsides of using Bootstrap? So I want to give you a kind of honest picture here. So one is it's a lot of code. So Bootstrap, you wouldn't know this, but requires one CSS file and 3 different JavaScript libraries. In order to make things like your carousel work or hovering over something, getting a tooltip, these kinds of things require lots and lots of code. And this is on the order of hundreds of kilobytes of code. And that doesn't sound like it's a lot. But keep in mind that each request is going to slow down your web page. And some people are just like, oh, this web page is taking too long, I'm going to close it. So that's a very important thing to think about, especially if someone's internet is slow, if they're on data or something like that. So Bootstrap is very what we call heavy. There's a lot of stuff involved in Bootstrap, and you can't not use these JavaScript things, or else Bootstrap just won't work. So that's kind of problematic, right? You don't want your code to be too heavy. So that's one thing that people don't like about Bootstrap. The second thing that people don't like about Bootstrap is that most people do not change from the default theme. So what that's going to mean is that everyone's website looks the same. And if you care a lot about making a unique website for your portfolio, for example, you want it to stand out, you probably don't want to show your recruiter the stereotypical example Bootstrap page. Like if you showed your recruiter this and this was your thing, they'd be like, wow, I've probably seen this like 500 times while recruiting. This is nothing new, right? You want to give them a bit of a surprise. In some cases, this isn't important. So if you're making like a website for a research lab, right? Or just to display data, yeah, use Bootstrap's default theme. That's totally fine. But if you're doing it all by yourself and you want to make a very, unique website, I would say Bootstrap is probably not the play unless you really want to dig deep and customize it. But the big takeaway though is that it's really big. It's a lot of code that you don't need. And sometimes it lets people fall back on creating similar looking websites. But yeah, that's Bootstrap in a nutshell. Very quickly, just how's Bootstrap doing? So they're doing really, really well. They're currently on version 4, but they're about to release version 5, and they're dropping jQuery. So they were like, oh no, like our file's too big. So they're dropping one of their libraries. They're also releasing their own icon set, which is very exciting. So in general, Bootstrap's doing really, really well. Vibrant community. If you ever need help, you can always go on Stack Overflow. There's tons of people who talk about Bootstrap all the time. It's one of the big benefits of having such a big community. And the documentation is very good. It tells you everything you need to know. Okay, enough about Bootstrap. You'll hear about it all the time if you do web development, so just something to keep in the back of your mind. The next one I want to talk about is Bulma. Bulma is another really popular CSS framework. As you can see here, 700,000 people download it every month. That's a lot of people. And it's a lot like Bootstrap, okay? Let's be honest. It's very component-based as well. So if you notice, they'll give you a lot of very similar looking components, like a menu, like a card. I'm sorry, Peter. Like a modal, like pagination, tabs, panels, nav bars, right? These are the kinds of things that you would expect on most websites. So it's very convenient. And I'm not going to tell you more about what they offer because it's very similar to Bootstrap. So what makes Bulma different from Bootstrap? If I had to spectrum it, Bootstrap is extremely component heavy, right? They include so much code that gives you so many pre-built components. Bulma has less of these things. It's a little less on the component framework side, right? So something that you'll notice, and they have actually a page that compares it to Bootstrap. So one of, in my opinion, the biggest differences is that Bulma doesn't have JavaScript. And this is good and it's bad. Why is it good? It's less code. Your page loads a lot quicker. But why is it bad? Some things require JavaScript. So for example, right, one very common feature you might want is if your screen becomes smaller, the navigation bar should become like this thing. This is called the hamburger menu. You click it and you should get something like this. You can almost not implement this with only CSS. The best way to do it is with JavaScript. Bulma doesn't give you that. So you have to kind of get your hands dirty and write that code yourself. At the same time, maybe that's something you're fine with doing because this is not that hard. That's like 3 lines of JavaScript. But if you find yourself building an even more complex website, you have modals all the time and cars and carousels, you know, maybe something like Bootstrap would fit you more. But if you know, hey, my website's just going to be, you know, a table about soccer leagues, right? There's no interaction going on. Something like Bulma will make your page load faster and rely on less code. So does that kind of make sense? It's kind of the trade-off between things like Bulma and Bootstrap. I'll say that most CSS frameworks you'll see, so I'm going to include a lot more in the description of the lesson, are like Bulma. There's not that much JavaScript involved. Bootstrap is able to do all these things because they used to be backed by Twitter and now they're backed by GitHub. They have a really, really big developer team. And that's another core difference I want to highlight. So Bulma is mostly written by this one guy called Jeremy Thomas. Jeremy Thomas is really, really cool, right? He's a really smart guy. His website looks amazing. And he does a lot of really cool CSS stuff. But at the same time, it's also only one guy. So they don't publish releases as quickly as Bootstrap does, because Bootstrap has this huge team of tons of people and a dedicated product manager. So if you are someone who's working for an enterprise client, right? Maybe you're working for a really big client and you need to rely on updates quickly, then maybe Bulma is also not what you want. So just something to think about. But for most of our cases, learning labs, ACM in general, it's not going to be a problem. I'm sure Bulma will be fine. Okay, cool. I want to keep this relatively short. The last one I want to talk about is Tailwind. So if Bootstrap is super componenty and Bulma is like mostly componenty, Tailwind is no components at all, literally. So Tailwind is a CSS framework, but they don't give you any prepackaged components. So Peter's going to be super happy. There's no cards involved in Tailwind. All Tailwind does is it gives you CSS classes that are shorthands for common behaviors, like adding a border, or adding a shadow, or changing the text color. Now, this is good and bad, right? So it's great because you get tons and tons of power, right? You can customize your components exactly how you want. It doesn't have to be how Bootstrap has designed them. And it's a lot lighter because you don't have to package a bunch of code for a component that you're never going to use, okay? But the huge, huge downside is that it's a really steep learning curve, right? If I gave you something like this, right, I would wage and say that the average developer doesn't know off the top of their head what CSS properties they need to change to make a div look like this, right? You'll probably experiment a bit. And that's really hard to do with Tailwind. And as your UI gets more and more complex, if you're not used to this kind of thinking, this is going to get really hard. At the same time, there are some people who are just super big Tailwind fans. In the same way that there are people who are like diehard Emacs or Nano or Vim fans, or use LaTeX, right? Once you figure out how that software works, then this is like way easier than anything Bootstrap or Bulma does. And I'm sure Peter can tell you that from using LaTeX compared to like Word. At the same time, Word is way more popular because it's super user-friendly, it's drag and drop, and it's really easy to do. So that's kind of the trade-off that you're making here. But as I mentioned again, Tailwind, no JavaScript dependencies, super, super light framework, much lighter than both Bulma and Bootstrap. And they still have solid documentation and a vibrant community. A lot of people use Tailwind. Okay, cool. The last thing I want to briefly talk about is Actually, that's not true. Let's talk about two quick things. So one thing I'll talk about is, okay, so where can you find more information about these things? We haven't really talked about GitHub, but GitHub is a website. It's not only for cheating on CS homeworks. It's also great for sharing code and working on open source software. So you can find CSS frameworks on GitHub all the time. And usually you'll find either links to their documentation, you can contribute, which is really, really fun, and tons of other good stuff. So I would definitely say you can go on GitHub. GitHub also lets you search by tags. So you can select the CSS framework tag and it'll tell you popular CSS framework. So if this wasn't enough for you, you can head here and find out more. Second thing I just want to talk about very quickly is customizing your own CSS framework. So it sounds like it's very scary, but I'm going to tell you right now that it's really, really easy. And we're going to talk about this in the SAS lesson. I think Leo's teaching next Friday. But I'm just going to let you know it's very easy. And Tailwind actually uses post CSS and CSS variables, which is a little trickier. And I don't think we'll cover CSS variables because they're not supported by all browsers really yet. But for things like Bootstrap, if you want to make it the ACM colors or the ACM AI colors, you know, it's really, really easy. It'll take you like 5 minutes. Okay, great. I'm going to cover some wraparound content that's in the README, but I don't think it's super key. But if you're watching at home, you can skip now. It's totally fine. Two other things I want to bring up. So one is, you know, Tailwind is still a CSS framework. What's something that's just a CSS library? I'm going to give you two examples. One is Font Awesome. So Font Awesome is a very powerful icon library. That's just icons. That's it. That's all it does. And you can do them in CSS. You can do them in JavaScript. You can do them with React. It's very convenient. Look at this. They have 7,800 icons. If you're making a website, you can probably find an icon that's related to what you need here. And they have brands and they have, you know, things that you'd expect in menus and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of free. So they have like a free tier with like 2,000 icons, and then you have to pay for the other 6,000. Still a good service, but you don't get all of them for free. This is one avenue. Another is something like animate CSS. Yeah, so this is a library that literally only provides like functionality, right? So here, it just gives you a bunch of CSS animations that you can use, but you don't have to code them yourself. We're going to find out tomorrow that CSS animations are pretty easy, but some of these are a little tricky to do by yourself. So that's just what this library does. It's nothing too tricky, but now you know. So this is like very on the library side. There's no components provided at all. Last thing I want to talk about before we adjourn, and I let Peter free, is jQuery. So this is related to Bootstrap. So as I mentioned earlier, Bootstrap has a few dependencies, and one of them is jQuery. And I couldn't really fit this in any of the other lessons, so I thought this was just the most appropriate one. If you go on Stack Overflow, you're going to find a lot of questions that say something like, how do I change the inside of a div in JavaScript, right? Or, you know, how do I find every other div in a container? And some of the most upvoted answers are going to say, oh, download jQuery and use it. So what is jQuery? jQuery is a JavaScript library, and its original purpose was to fix a lot of the problems with web browsers. Because it used to be that lots of web browsers, especially frickin' Internet Explorer, would not implement JavaScript the same way as other browsers. So if you want to do something like make a request to an API, right? Or sort a list, or left pad something, you couldn't be guaranteed that your browser had that functionality. So instead, jQuery would run a bunch of code, check what browser it is, do those guarantees for you, and then provide you with some consistent interface. So that's why jQuery exists. And in 2012, when Bootstrap was first created, jQuery was really important because the browser space was really fragmented and no one worked with each other. And this was a big problem. And this was also when, you know, Flash was so popular when people run Java and Silverlight applets and stuff like that. Fast forward to 2020, this is like no longer a problem. Less than 1% of the average user base uses Internet Explorer 10 or below. And most browsers now use either Chrome's engine, Firefox's engine, or Safari's engine. So that's only 3 engines. It's not as hard as it used to be. There used to be like 10, 12 you had to support. And these people now work together. Apple and Google and Mozilla now work together on making new features. What that means is that you don't need jQuery anymore. You don't need to have a library that guarantees you all these kinds of things. So what I'm saying is don't use jQuery unless you know you have to for some reason. So one example is maybe you're working for a hospital and the company's IT system only uses Internet Explorer 9. Then you should use jQuery. But for our learning labs, we don't need to use jQuery at all. If you see a Stack Overflow question that answers, you can do this with jQuery, you can also do it without jQuery. There's always an answer to do it because jQuery is just a JavaScript library. Last thing I'm going to point out is with jQuery is you definitely should not use it in an app with React. And this is like a huge pet peeve that I have when I see people use jQuery, because all it does is it makes your app really, really slow, and there's no reason to have jQuery because React polyfills everything you need anyways with Babel. Okay, so long story short, what did we cover today? Talk about CSS frameworks. It's very, very useful. You can create beautiful components like this card, beautiful, with very little effort, and they're very, very popular. You can use them on your portfolio. You can use them in your learning lab, and I'd encourage you to play one out. The last thing I want to say, other than don't use jQuery, is there is no one CSS framework that's the best, right? I'm never going to tell you you should only use Bootstrap or you should only use Bulma or Tailwind. And people who do that or say stuff like people who use Bootstrap aren't real coders are just really douchey gatekeepers. So don't listen to those people. I would encourage you to, when you have the free time, practice and play with them. They all have different characteristics and ways they name their classes and how things interact with each other. And eventually you'll probably find one or two that you enjoy using the most, and then you'll use those in your projects, and that's totally fine. So just something to think about, and please keep this in mind. Next Tuesday, we're going to start designing. Bootstrap is great because you can design something and then easily implement rough sketches of what it'll look like. And other frameworks are like that too. So now you have an idea of what kinds of things are easy to implement, like a carousel, like a card, like a nav bar. And you can look to Bootstrap, take some inspiration, and kind of figure that out. But yeah, that's it for this video. It's pretty short. If you watch this on 2x speed, I respect that. If you watch it on 1x speed, I think you should watch it on 2x speed. And yeah, that's it. If you have any feedback for us, as always, please let us know. You can email us, you can message us in Slack, you can comment in the YouTube comments. I'm going to leave the notes for this lesson and the portfolio task in the YouTube description. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a great day. Stay safe. And thanks for sticking in with us.